Thank you very much for coming. I want to start with a short story. I teach at IDC, the Interdisciplinary Center, and we have a career fair from time to time. And one of the recent ones, Optimove, was coming to recruit people. They had a booth. And one of my students went to the booth to see what's going on there. And then she met me, shocked, and she said, they actually do what you talk about in class. So I said, yeah, people do that, but I thank Optimove for doing what I talk about in class and for serving as a bridge. And I think that these bridges are very important, bridges of knowledge between academia and industry and between various parts of industry. I see it much more in the US when I work with companies than in here, and I'm very glad that there are these kinds of Optimoves also here. So I'm going to talk about retention, and I'm going to talk about things that I do research on. As I said, I'm a professor at IDC, and I've been in the Technion, the Tel Aviv University, and the MIT, the Sloan School, dealing with these issues. And I come from a different angle, I think, than the last panel came from. But before I go to the issues that I want to focus on, I want to talk about where retention started. Because if you think about customer retention in general, if you look at the 1970s, 1980s, nobody talked about it. You couldn't find almost anything in business press, in academia, and so on. And it is rare that a single article really changes an industry. And this is one of the rare cases that I want to mention. And it's an article which was published in 1990 by people from Bain. Bain is, some of you know, a very large consulting company in the US. And it partly describes the study that they had in which they were asked to analyze the sources of profitability in an industry called brokerage insurance in the US. And that's what companies like that do from time to time. And they tried all kinds of data and factors to understand why some companies are better than others. And at one point of time when they couldn't, they asked their analysts to talk with people who left the companies. And after 2 days came back the analyst that was assigned Johnson and Higgins, that were the leaders in this industry, and said, this is not fair. I've been trying to get people for 2 days on the phone. I cannot get anyone. Let's do it otherwise. Let's spread the job otherwise. And they said, you know something? This is interesting. Let's look at retention. And there they got the bingo. You see here on the x-axis, the customer retention rate, and here the pre-tax profit margin. It was the first time they got a real connection between profitability and a factor, and they widened afterwards this research, did it in Europe, and so on, and really began to try to influence, to convince managers that retention is very important. And the story which they explained, for example, in the credit card industry, that at that time had a 90% yearly retention rate and was quite happy with that. And they said, look what will happen if you'll go up to 95. Because if you go up to 95, 90, 95 both sound very nice, but the gap widens with time. So the value of a customer goes up with time, and the difference is larger and larger, and they published this graph, which is really one of the most well-known graphs of the 1990s in terms of CRM, that says how much the profitability of companies will change, customer profitability, if we reduce defection rate by 5% or increase retention rate. So this has really had an effect on industries. It's in many textbooks because suddenly managers saw that we are talking about 75% and 50% and so on. So this is serious. You're talking about a lot of money. So this was the early 90s, and the idea that they drove that became really the CRM movement is that when we lose a customer, we lose their lifetime value. And again, at that time, nobody even talked the language of lifetime value. And of course, when the expected retention rate is high, the loss is high, and therefore we want to work on retention. And this was the base to much of the CRM movement, that what is going on here today is really a continuation of that stream. I want to talk about a similar but a bit different subject. So indeed, when we lose a customer, we lose the lifetime value. But customers not only buy. Customers also affect others. So in fact, we can still think of the market as consisting of different lifetime values of customers, but then some customers affect the lifetime value of other customers. So in fact, if you think about the value of a customer that we lose their lifetime value, and we may lose what I call their social value. Social value is their effect on other customers. So when we talk about retention, we should think about both. And the question is, how do we deal with that? And when I talk about this with my students, with managers, they say, yes, of course, you're right, but you cannot measure that. So I would argue that you can at least try, and I can tell you that in the last 10 years, there have been a lot of efforts in this area. We have more and more data. I've been dealing quite a lot with this issue. And I think that as we progress and we get better data, we'll become better and better in this area as well. So before I want to show you some findings on that, and this is mainly what I want to do, to show you some thoughts or findings on social value and what drives it, I want to say a few things about measurement. So there are three major ways that I would mention in the measurement of social value. One of them is just experiments. And some of you in the panel and others mentioned A/B testing. So testing has become a norm in many industries, which I think is very good. And we see testings that try to assess social value as well. Tremor, for example, which is a Procter & Gamble company that deals with word-of-mouth marketing, constantly compares different markets with different word-of-mouth programs to see if indeed the word-of-mouth program had an effect and how much can you attribute to each member. This is another example of testing to some extent, a natural experiment. HP trying to introduce a new gamer laptop in 2007 called the Dragon. Didn't work that well. I mean, it worked, but gradually declined. And then they had a program with 31 bloggers, influentials, that was called the 31 Days of the Dragon. No other marketing effort at that time. This is how sales went up and enormous effects on sales. They won the first prize in the Word of Mouth Marketing Association on that issue. By the way, if you want a resource about word of mouth and marketing, I'm on their advisory board, so I am a bit biased, but generally this is one of they call WOMA, WOMMA, and they have quite many resources on word of mouth and what you can do with that. So experiments is one. The other one is advanced regression analysis, and this is, of course, what we like in academia because we like to do complicated statistic analysis. And again, we have more and more data today that enables us to do a better job in trying to figure out from the data what is the role of word of mouth in the profit that had been created, especially if we know something of the communication that they get, communication between people, and today in social media, we begin to be able to get data more and more. The idea, more or less, is trying to understand how a person's behavior changes as a function of the people around them. So if Guy here buys something and then I see their social network doing something, then I assume that indeed something is happening, and of course it doesn't have to be so. So you have to rule out all kind of explanation. There is an Israeli company called Persuade. Someone is interested who's dealing quite with state-of-the-art analysis of that kind of an analysis. So this is another type of analysis that people are doing today. Another type which I do quite a lot is called agent-based models, in generally simulation. Some of you, I don't know how many, played SimCity when they were younger, or maybe even today. So you create a would-be world and play with it. So this is also what I do. I take data from real social networks, and I build a world based on these social networks and as realistic assumptions as possible. And then I do experiments. Now, the basic idea is to kill the customer. Now, I know that many of you in your career have thought more than once about killing a customer or two. It's very natural, but I actually do that. So what I do in that sense is look at this system, this agent-based model, and say, what would have happened if Guy would not be here? Because Guy is part of a system in which lifetime value is created by himself, but also his effect on others. And it's very hard to describe analytically or in a simple way, because one person affects another, that affects another, but the other guy could have been affected by another person, so it's not clear if we will not have Guy if something would have happened and how it would affect the lifetime values. But using simulations, and I think really simulations is the future of word of mouth in that sense. If you use realistic simulation, you can really understand the dynamics of what is going on. So these were a few words about how we do, and I want to talk about the what. So some insights on customer social value. And I want to start and talk about new products. And new products do not have to be very new products. All of you within the companies that you operate today, most of you introduce new products from time to time within the framework of your own company. And I want to argue first that the value of a lost customer is especially high early on. Now, this is something that many of you have seen in some kind of studies, this famous bell-shaped curve, the diffusion curve of new products. First, you have the innovators, and then the early adopters, and early majority, and so on. And what I claim is that the people here, their social value is especially high, and therefore when we lose them, we lose a lot. Now, you may say, of course, they talk more. And I say, maybe, I don't know, but that I don't take this into account. I don't assume that they talk more. What I argue is that even if they don't talk more, they are really a loss if we lose them. And the story is, again, the story of diffusion, in which we know, this is very sound knowledge over 100 years, that these curves are driven by people affecting other people. So much, you have talked here also in the panel about how to get new customers and how to approach them and how to retain and so on. Much of the action in many products in the market is actually about communication between people. So we get to some people, and many people are the byproduct of the ripple that begins with our beginning marketing activities. So when we lose a customer, this whole curve becomes a bit slower. Now, again, I don't assume now negative word of mouth. You could also argue about that. I say, forget that for a minute. It will amplify everything that I'll say. But without negative word of mouth, without the people here talking too much, more than others, the mere fact that I lose someone here slows the curve a bit, and because of the difference in value of money over time, we have a loss of social value. I want to show you an analysis that was done, again, I cannot get here into the details, but on the case of online banking. Online banking is an interesting story, because when they came out in the mid to late 1990s, in the industry they talked about a marriage from heaven. People don't like banks, and banks don't like people. Now, they like their money, but they don't like them to come to the bank because it cost them, at the time, they estimated $1.07 for each interaction with the teller. So they thought that e-commerce and electronic banking is great because it's only 2 to 3 cents, and then their lifetime value will be higher. But it didn't work that way. If you look at the late 90s, the beginning of the 2000s, there were many disadoptions, many problems with retention because the sites were not that great, not user-friendly, not secure, and so on. The question is, how much money did they lose because they lost these customers? This is what you see here is an assessment of the 5-year lifetime value loss because someone went back from online banking to regular banking. This $1.07 over 5 years, and this is a bit more than $200. This is the lifetime, again, and what you see here on the x-axis is the years since introduction. So this is, year 1 would be something like 1997 or 98 and so on. This is the social value. This is the loss due to the effect on the lifetime value of other people, and this is their sum. What you see is that early on, in the beginning of the life cycle, you lose more money by the fact that people don't affect others than their own lifetime value, if you lose them. And I can generalize, because this analysis can be done on other products, and say that generally, for new products, early enough in the product life cycle, you lose more from losing the social value than lifetime value. People can ask why early, and the issue is that early on, and it can be shown also mathematically in other ways, these are the people that actually create the bell-shaped curve. They give it the boost, the snowball in the beginning. And they push everything. If you do not have enough people in the beginning, it will take much more time. Afterwards, when you have many people and you lose one person, it's not that terrible. In the beginning, you do not want to lose them. And I think that it's fundamental, because what we see is indeed that here, you see that I divided it by innovators and early adopters and so on. If the lifetime value is about $200, the value, social value of innovators and early adopters comes more larger than the lifetime value. And we see it, and again, this was, you can say, okay, this is the 1990s, 2000, what's going on today with digital products, fast-moving apps, as you talked about. It's more or less the same story. And we know part of what I'm looking also today in my research is the effect of ranking tables on growth. And those of you who deal with apps know that in order to enjoy growth, you need to get into the ranking, the popularity ranking. And if you can get early, then you can build the momentum that will take you more into the later tables. And we know today, as much as they talk about, also that app stores take retention into account in rankings. And we know that word of mouth plays a significant role in the adoption of applications. All of that saying that if you lose a person early on, and early in this world might be one day instead of the 20th day, again, it's much more money. I think that the implications are fundamental, because when I talk to managers about these issues, and I ask them, when you think about customer acquisition and retention, how do you work on what in a new product? And almost always, all over the world, from China to the US to Singapore, whatever, the answer is, first of all, we'll do customer acquisition, and then when we have enough customers, then we'll do retention. And I answer, big mistake. Big mistake, because when you lose a customer, you lose your customer acquisition. In products that are driven by word of mouth, and most of the products of the people sitting here are largely driven by word of mouth, when you lose a customer, you lose the ability to get other customers. So if you want to build a service center or to give adequate service, early on is even more important, because these are the people that will enjoy growth. You will not have the other people to do the retention if you don't do the retention well early on. So this is one thing I want to say. Second thing, retention rate affects much the value of a lost customer. What do I mean by that? Look, this is, again, going back to the world of applications, etc. These are the findings by Fleury, 2014, about retention rates at different application categories. There is a very large difference between categories. Some categories, the retention rate is 3 times the one that, for example, here in news, it's much larger than in music or in medical. So the question is, what do we care in terms of social value? Of course, when we lose a person here, we lose more maybe because the retention rate is higher, as we talked about. But what I want to say is know that you lose also more social value, because your social value, my social value as a customer, depends on the lifetime value I will affect with other customers. So if I affect Yossi and Shlomo and Nechama, and all of them have a high retention rate, my social value is also higher. So what I'm saying, if you're up here in terms of retention, you should be even more worried. Should be more worried, because when you lose the word of mouth, you lose more money than others. Number 3, going back to mature, a bit more mature products. So I talked about new products, and you would say, okay, new products, I understand the adoption, of new products, there is risk, but in mature products, it doesn't play such a role. So it's a good question. And this is a study that I did with Irit Nitzan, who was my doctoral student at the time, now at Tel Aviv University. And we looked at the mobile operators. So as we all know, this is 2008, before the big earthquake in mobile. And the question was, do we really care if people that we know leave the company that we are in? Because, let's say today I'm a customer of Partner, and let's say I have friends who are with Partner as well. Do I really care if they leave Partner? And you can argue that I shouldn't, because I know Partner as good as they are. If they leave, they leave. What do I care? So the question is, how do you know? And this is the kind of data that we have today and we didn't have in the past. So we managed to convince the cellular company to cooperate with us, and we got the data, the log data of 1 million private customers and how they talk to each other. And of course, we don't know the names, we just had an ID, but we could build the social networks of 1 million customers. And we know from other research, from the Media Lab at MIT, that cellular networks represent real social networks quite well. So now we could ask the question, because we knew the social networks of all the people, and we say, okay, let's look at a person, and let's look what happens if their friends leave. Would it affect them? And then the answer is, you bet. And what you see here, just as an example, what you see here is the number of defecting friends that a non-defector has and a defector has on average during 2008, and you see that the difference is really large. And of course, we did a much deeper statistical analysis, controlling for other things, but the story at the end of the day is that a friend that left in the last month raised defection probability by 80%. Now, it's not going up to 80, it's going from 1% to 1.8 or whatever. But it's a lot of money. You should know that. So, and interestingly, you can see how it drops with time. So this is the hazard rate, what we call it. It's a survival analysis method. So this is the hazard rate if it was last month, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and so on. So it drops exponentially, like you would expect, and people who talk more with others are affecting more, everything that you would expect. So word of mouth works in retention the same way that it works in adoption. Another question that you can ask, you say, okay, I understand that it works, but I don't look only at one person. I have many people. How does it go? When I lose 100 customers, is it like 100 times the loss of an individual? If it's just lifetime value, the answer is yes. If it's social value, it's more complicated. So again, you can do all kind of analysis here. Generally, what I can say is the marginal effect goes down, which means in plain English is that the loss of 100 customers is less than 100 times the loss of one customer, typically. And the story is that of overlap. Because if I am a friend of both Idan and Gil, and Idan left, that's a disaster. But afterwards, when Gil leaves, it's also a disaster, but not as large because already Idan created some disaster. So in a sense, it's going down unless there is a critical mass. If we see that 100 people really left and it affects everyone and the media begins to be interested in what's going on in this company, this can create an opposite effect. But generally, you should think also when you move from 1 to 100 to 1,000, you shouldn't just multiply. It's more complicated. Another finding, opinion leaders. So what happens with opinion leaders in the world of retention? So in the same manner that you might know for adoption, when we get an opinion leader, we make more money. When we lose an opinion leader, we lose more money as well because of two things. One thing is the loss of the positive effect. If they talked positively about our firm, we lost the positive effect. The other one is the possible creation of mass negative effect. So if they talk negatively, they also talk on more people. This is quite straightforward, and you can deal, there are different kinds of opinion leaders, hubs and connectors and so on. Those who are interested in that area can read about it in social network analysis. Many companies, clearly in the cellular world, but other worlds as well, are getting more and more into social network analysis these days. Clearly, social networking sites are dealing a lot with that. But I don't want to talk about opinion leaders. This is straightforward. I want to talk about revenue leaders. And revenue leaders are the people that have high lifetime value, or I expect them to have high lifetime value. And you can ask, if I lose them, I understand I lose the lifetime value. Do I also lose more social value? And the answer is yes. And not because there are opinion leaders, not necessarily because they talk much, maybe they do, but because they know the right people. There is something which is very fundamental in network analysis, which is called assortativity. I tend to be in social network with people like me. So if I am a very strong gamer in one domain, there is a better than average chance that my friends would have the same hobbies as well. So if I lose this heavyweight customer, I lose the opportunity to affect, through this customer, other heavyweight customers, more than other people. So when we lose revenue leaders, we lose also a great chance in terms of social value. This is an analysis that I did in a cellular world. And in terms of social value, the revenue leaders, the high lifetime value, are somewhere between random customers and opinion leaders. So they don't have the same social value as opinion leaders, but they are more than random. When you lose a heavyweight customer, you also lose more social value. I have only about 2 minutes, so I have some other things, but any questions, comments, thinking?
Do you think it's different between B2B businesses and business customers?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think basically what we know is that social influence exists very much in B2B situations. It's harder to measure. We do, when we can measure, we see the influence clearly, because think of how people make decisions. They go to, let's say, conferences, this one, and talk to other people, and what are you doing, what are you doing? So it's clearly there. Our ability to measure is lower. When we do measure, and there are some people who did that, we see a quite strong social value effect with B2B.
What do you think the difference between onboarding processes and retention processes? Where to draw the line?
I don't think that I will have time here to talk about it. It's a good question. I mean the issue of acquisition and retention in that sense is beyond the scope here. But again, there's literature on that. People write about it. There's a lot in the internet, I think, also. So it's too much scope to discuss here. Anyone? How much time do I have? 2 minutes. I talked about the relationship between lifetime value and social value, in the sense that people with high lifetime value may also have high social value. Now I want to talk about the other side. What we find out is that, and this is findings from recent years, that actually when you make people talk, you also increase their lifetime value. We've seen that. I have German colleagues who published an article in which they dealt with a referral reward program in Germany. And they incentivize people to talk. And what is interesting is not the social value created, but the mere fact that these people talked and they compared it to a control group, it changed their defection rates fell from 19% to 7% within a year, and their average monthly revenue grew by 11.4%. By mere talking, think about, you were talking about engagement here. When you create engagement, when you make people talk, they think about your product. They feel committed. They feel cognitive dissonance if they don't use it themselves. So talking does not only stem from lifetime value, it can affect the lifetime value of a sender. It's another reason to think about word of mouth. And again, I go back to these discussions that you'll have here today, and we all talk about campaigns and marketing and so on. Most of the campaigns that bring customers to your products come from current customers in many products. So this is something you should always have in the back of your mind in that sense. Last thing, I think, another thing to remember is that people that come via word of mouth are worth more than people that come via advertising. This is, again, a quite consistent finding. I have some colleagues that did it in online environments a few years ago, but I've seen it more and more. The people who arrive via word of mouth stay more, they have higher retention rates, they have higher spending over time. And again, when you think about different kind of customers, you may want to separate them. You might want to see if it's good in your place as well. It all leads to my argument that when you think of a lost customer, think of their social value, not only their lifetime value. It's not trivial to measure, but this is what is actually happening. Thank you very much.